We start this evening at the United Nations in New York. There, the UN Security Council convened to discuss the looming battle over Syria's Idlib province. RT's Dan Cohen has the story.
Staffan de Mistura, the UN Special Envoy, implored the Syrian and Russian governments to halt operations to liberate Idlib province from its al-Qaeda rulers.
The dangers are profound that any battle for Idlib would be a horrific and bloody battle. Civilians are its potential victims, and there are ever-present dangers in the case of a full-scale assault, of incidents or rapid escalations involving regional and international players.
The representatives from the US and UK accused Syria and Russia of targeting civilian infrastructure.
There are more babies in Idlib than there are terrorists. And I think that should give those engaging in military action pause for thought.
When Russia and the Assad regime say they want to counter terrorism, they actually mean they want to bomb schools, hospitals, and homes.
Russia's representative said the US and UK have no actual compunction for civilians and instead are seeking to prevent Syria from regaining control of its own territory.
We are firmly under the impression that our Western partners are stoking hysteria around Idlib and in any way are attempting to prevent the fall of the last major terrorist stronghold in Syria. And this is far more geopolitical than this stated humanitarian concern for the protection of civilians.
Syria's representative accused his Western counterparts of minimizing the threat of the armed opposition.
My British colleague said there are 50,000 terrorists in Idlib. Mr. de Mistura called them very few. There are very few terrorists in Idlib. But my dear colleague, we're talking about 50,000 terrorists. Can you imagine seeing 50,000 terrorists going to Manchester, wreaking havoc, and we would call them moderate British armed opposition? Can you imagine that? And then the OCHA would deliver humanitarian aid for them, so they stay alive in Manchester. It's absurd.
Reporting in Washington, Dan Cohen, RT.
For more, we turn to former Pentagon official Michael Maloof. Michael, thanks for joining us. You know, you have previously talked about how the Western attempts to isolate Syria and blame the Syrian government without evidence. What is your response to today's Security Council meeting?
Well, I think it's a last gasp on the part of the United States and the Western powers really to warn and try to contain their image and their position in Syria. It's in terms of a larger context, it's really an effort by the United States to try and maintain their position, to maintain that influence. And they feel that if you go into Idlib, it will get kinetic. And what's also occurred in recent days is interviews with James Jeffrey, who's now the envoy to Syria for the administration, has basically said whether or not chemical weapons are used, the intention is if there is any action, military action, the United States could step in with missile attacks. So that raises a further issue of escalation that we might be in store for. So we're at a very ominous period, and it also shows that the Trump administration's neoconservatives have basically won against Trump, who ultimately wanted better relationships with Vladimir Putin.
Well, that's interesting. You talk about how, the significance of Idlib now, but even to the bigger picture of the U.S. strategy in Syria and the Middle East, what role is it playing?
Well, it's having if the United States can bog down Russia and the Syrian military in Idlib, then that prevents them from then focusing on eastern Syria, which is where the United States intends to maintain its position. The United States is looking for a way to maintain its position in Syria, and by going with the Kurds in eastern Syria, it certainly is going to aggravate Turkey. And so the whole idea, if they can keep Moscow and Syria bogged down in Idlib, that gives the United States a longer ability to try to carve out a role for itself.
Absolutely. Well, Nikki Haley has accused Russia and Iran of endangering civilians in Idlib. But the Russian ambassador to the UN has said that the majority, 80% of the people in Idlib, actually want to see the war end as the terrorists are currently holding them hostage. What do you make of these conflicting comments, and how can civilians further be protected?
Well, there has been an effort to set up human corridors for months by the Russians. The Russians have sought to set up human corridors. They've also, through the reconciliation effort at Khaymamin Air Base outside of Latakia, have tried to bring in the militant groups and have them basically put down their arms and try to wean them away. But you're going to have the hardcore Al-Qaeda and ISIS types who are going to stay there and fight, and they're going to use the civilians as human shields. They may not even allow them to leave. So then the question arises, what does Russia do? And here it means you're going to have to set up corridors, strategic corridors, to go in and avoid as much aerial as possible, and even artillery.
Okay, well, so if Syria, with Iran and Russia's help, manages to regain Idlib, what last-ditch effort do you think, or you might expect, for the U.S. to oppose that campaign?
Well, if they go in kinetic into Idlib, it's possible the United States could go militarily as well. That will create a whole new posture for the United States to remain there, and the whole idea is to try and protect their interests in East Syria, which is where they really want to hold out, because that also strategically helps them with Iraq.